raised his glass and looked right through me like I wasn't there, like I was furniture, like the woman who had spent 31 years raising the person sitting beside him in a white dress was simply not worth acknowledging. And then he leaned into the microphone, smiled at the room full of people, and said something I will never forget for as long as I live. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand where I came from, to understand what happened that night in that banquet hall in Kelowna. My name is Loretta. I'm 63 years old. I live in a small house in Barrie, Ontario, just off Dunlop Street, the same house I bought on my own in 1998 with a down payment I had been scraping together for 4 years. The floors creak. The radiator in the back bedroom sounds like a kettle when the temperature drops below -10. I have never once considered selling it, because every single corner of that house reminds me of what I built without anyone's help. I had my daughter, Chloe, when I was 32. Her father, a man I will call what he was, someone who left, walked out when she was 18 months old. He moved to Calgary, sent a card on her 3rd birthday. After that, nothing. I filed for child support. He declared bankruptcy. The system did what systems do, which is nothing useful, so it was just us. I worked at a telecommunications call center in Barrie for 11 years. The shift started at 6:30 in the morning. I would wake Chloe up at 5, dress her in the dark, drive her to my neighbor Mrs. Hannigan's house, and Mrs. Hannigan would walk her to school. That arrangement cost me $60 a week, which in 1995 was not nothing. I kept a jar on the kitchen counter where I put coins every evening, toonies, loonies, quarters. Chloe thought it was a wishing jar. I let her think that. When she was 7, she asked me why we didn't go to Florida in March like a classmate Brittany did every year. I told her that Florida was overrated and that we had the best backyard in the province. We didn't. It was a strip of dead grass with a broken fence. But we put a bird feeder out there, and Chloe kept a notebook of every species she spotted, and she filled 3 notebooks before she turned 12, and I still have every one of them in a box under my bed. I'm telling you these things because I need you to understand the texture of those years. They were hard, and they were also mine. They were also hers. I went back to school nights when Chloe was in grade 4, took a bookkeeping certificate through Georgian College, then kept going until I had my CPA designation. It took 7 years. Some of those nights I studied at the kitchen table while she slept, and I could hear the radiator, and I thought, I will make this work. 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 Like a prayer you say so many times it stops having words. I eventually left the call center and got a position with a property management company, Howlaway Properties, based out of Barrie. They managed rental units across Simcoe County. I worked my way up to head of finance, decent salary, good benefits, RRSP matching. By the time Chloe finished high school, I had the mortgage mostly paid down and money in her SP. Not a fortune. Enough. She was 24 when she met him. His name is Scott. He's a civil engineer. She met him at a conference in Toronto. He's fine. He was always fine. Quiet, a little formal but kind to her in the ways that mattered. I liked him well enough. I want to be honest about that because this story isn't about Scott. It's about his father. His father's name is Victor Ashfield. If you're from the Okanagan, you may have heard that name. He built Ashfield Development Group out of Kelowna starting in the late 1980s. Residential and commercial projects across the interior of BC. Shopping centres, subdivisions, a few condo towers in the downtown Kelowna area. He is the kind of man who enters a room and immediately makes sure everyone in it knows he's entered. The handshake, the voice, the way his eyes move around a room like he's calculating the square footage of it. I met him for the first time at a dinner in Kelowna, 18 months before the wedding. A Saturday evening in January. His wife, Pamela, was there, a quiet woman who smiled constantly and said very little. Their home was extraordinary, not a word I use lightly. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the lake, a kitchen that was bigger than my entire main floor, a dining room table that seated 14. I wore my good blazer, the green one I'd bought for my firm's Christmas party. I felt, sitting at that table, the specific feeling of knowing you don't belong in a room, but refusing to let it show on your face. Victor talked mostly about the industry, projects he'd completed, projects under development. He asked me once what I did. I told him. He nodded in the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. The conversation moved on. Chloe called me the next morning. "He's just like that," she said. "He's not trying to be rude." "I know," I said. I didn't fully know, but I let it go. The engagement was announced the following spring. The wedding was set for the following September in Kelowna at a venue called the Orchard House. 280 guests, catered, full reception. Victor was paying for most of it. I contributed what I could, which was enough for the rehearsal dinner and Chloe's dress alterations and a few other things. Victor made sure I was aware of the proportions, not directly, but he had a way of mentioning numbers that made the proportions clear. I want to tell you about the seating arrangements because it matters for what happened later. Chloe and Scott sat at the head table with the wedding party. I was seated at a table near the front, but not at the head table. Victor and Pamela and their immediate family were at a table to the left of the head table, closer to the center of the room. When I asked Chloe about it during the planning, she said it was because the head table was only for the wedding party. I accepted that. What I didn't understand and didn't say anything about was that during the ceremony I had been placed in the third row. The third row. I'm the only parent she has ever had. I sat in the third row in a mint green dress that I had driven to Toronto to buy because I wanted to look like someone who belonged in that room, and Victor and Pamela sat in the front row on the groom's side, and I told myself it didn't matter. The reception was beautiful. There was a band. There was a salmon station and a carving station and little cups of poutine with pulled pork that Chloe had insisted on because she said, "Mom, it's Canada, we have to." I laughed when she told me that. I thought about the coin jar on the kitchen counter. I thought about the bird notebooks under my bed. Victor stood up to give his speech early in the evening. He tapped his glass. The room went quiet, and he spoke for about 12 minutes about Scott, about how Scott had built something his father was proud of, about the Ashfield family legacy and what it meant to carry that name forward. He talked about the property empire he had spent his life building and what it would mean to welcome Chloe into it. And then, near the end, he said, and I am not going to forget this word for word, he said, "Some of us come from old roots and some of us come from, well, simpler beginnings. But we welcome everyone to the Ashfield table." He looked at me when he said it. The table near me went quiet for just a fraction of a second, long enough. I felt it like a temperature change in the room. My sister-in-law Greta, who was sitting beside me, put her hand on my wrist. I smiled. I picked up my glass. I drank. My daughter was looking at me from the head table. She had that look on her face, the one I'd seen since she was small, the particular combination of guilt and hope, the look that said, "Please don't make this into something." I smiled at her too. I did not stand up that night. I want to be clear about that. I gave my speech, the mother of the bride speech I had been writing in my head for 6 years and on actual paper for 3 months. And I talked about the bird notebooks and the coin jar and the drive to Mrs. Biller, Hannigan's in the dark, and the Georgian College Library at 10 o'clock at night, and every single thing I had done. And I said it all calmly and clearly. And I did not cry. I never cry in public. My mother taught me that. She said, "Save the tears for when you're alone and give people your strength when they're watching." When I sat down, the room applauded, and Chloe was crying and Victor was not clapping. He was just watching me with that appraising look. And I thought, not yet, but soon. Here is what nobody in that room knew that night. 14 years earlier, I had been assigned to audit the accounts for a company called Westlake Residential, a smaller property management firm that had contracted with Halloway for financial oversight services. It was routine work, or it was supposed to be. What I found was not routine. Westlake had been systematically overcharging the city of Barrie on 3 affordable housing contracts. Inflated invoices, falsified completion certificates, work that was billed as complete that had never been started. Roughly $2.3 million over 6 years. And Westlake's primary investor, the silent partner whose name appeared on the original incorporation documents from 1999, was Ashfield Development Group, Victor Ashfield. I brought my findings to Halloway's senior partners. I documented everything. Printed copies, digital backup on an external drive I kept at home. The partners took the files and told me they would handle it. They said it was complex. They said there were relationships involved. They asked me to keep it internal for the time being. 6 weeks later, one of the Halloway partners called me and said that after review, they had concluded the discrepancies were the result of administrative errors. The file was closed. I was 39 years old. I was a single mother. I had a mortgage and a child in grade 8, and no appetite for what it would cost me to push further against men who had decided not to look. But I kept the documents. I put them in a manila envelope, and I labeled it with a date, and I put it at the back of a file box in my home office. And every time I moved it, I thought, someday. I didn't connect Victor Ashfield to those documents until Chloe brought Scott home for the first time. It was the name that did it, not Scott's last name, which is Morrison, his mother's name he'd taken in adulthood, but Victor's full name, which Chloe mentioned casually on the phone. Victor Ashfield, Kelowna, property development. I went still in a way she couldn't see through the phone. I went to my home office that same evening, and I pulled out the manila envelope. I did not tell Chloe. I've thought about this decision every single day since then. I know how it looks. I know what people will say, and some of them will be right. She was building a life with this man. What she didn't know couldn't hurt the relationship before it started. I told myself I didn't have enough yet. I told myself I needed to think. I told myself it was 14 years old and maybe it had been resolved in ways I wasn't aware of. I told myself all the things you tell yourself when you know the truth and you're not ready to carry what the truth requires. The wedding happened. Victor made his speech. I made mine. People danced. The poutine cups were a hit. What I did in the 2 months after the wedding is the part of this story I'm most proud of. I reached out through a contact at my firm to a journalist named, I'll call her TB. She asked me not to use her full name, a journalist who covered municipal accountability for a regional news outlet in BC. I sent her scanned copies of the original documents with a summary of what I'd found and when. I told her about the Halloway dismissal. I told her about the affordable housing contracts. I told her what I knew, and I told her what I couldn't prove yet, and I told her where the gaps were. She spent 5 months. She filed access to information requests. She interviewed former Westlake employees, 2 of whom agreed to speak on record. She found a second set of contracts from 2008 in Kelowna that followed the same pattern, this time involving a seniors' housing project. The story published on a Thursday morning in March. By Friday, the city of Kelowna had announced an independent audit of Ashfield Development Group's municipal contracts. By the following Monday, Victor Ashfield's lawyers had issued a statement. By Wednesday, Scott had called me. "Did you know?" he asked. His voice was even. "He's an engineer. He processes things methodically." "Yes," I said. "I found it 14 years ago. I didn't know how to act on it then. I do now." There was a long pause. "Okay," he said finally. "Just that. Okay." Chloe called me an hour later. She was not as calm. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me before the wedding, before I was already in this family?" "Because I loved you and I was afraid," I said. And because I wasn't sure, and because I'm human and I made a choice that I know wasn't entirely right, and I'm sorry. She didn't speak to me for 6 weeks. 6 weeks is a long time at my age. It's a long time at any age. I kept going to work. I drove past the turnoff for the highway to Toronto, where I used to take her for dentist appointments when she was small, because our dental coverage only covered certain providers in the city. I raked my lawn. I called Greta, and we had dinner twice a week. I did not call Chloe. I told myself she needed space, and I told myself I had done what was right. And I told myself all of that in the dark beside the radiator that still sounds like a kettle, and some nights I believed it, and some nights I didn't. She came on a Sunday. She drove from Toronto, just her, no Scott. She knocked on the door of the house on Dunlop Street, and when I opened it, she looked older than her age, in the way that people look when they've been carrying something heavy. And she said, "I need to see the bird notebooks." I don't know why that was what she said. I think she needed to remember who we were before all of this. I brought out the box from under my bed and we sat on the floor of my bedroom and went through all 3 notebooks. Her handwriting getting neater as you went through the years. Ruby-throated hummingbirds circled in red because she'd been so excited, and she cried and I held her and I thought, this is still here. This is still a thing that nobody can take. The independent audit found discrepancies of over $4 million across multiple contracts in BC. Victor Ashfield was removed from the board of his own company pending investigation. He has not been charged as of the time I'm telling this story, but the investigation is ongoing. His lawyers say he was unaware of the practices. The 2 former Westlake employees who spoke on record say otherwise. Pamela, I heard through Scott, has gone to stay with her sister in Victoria. Scott and Chloe are still in Toronto. Things are complicated for them in ways I don't fully know because it's not my marriage, and I try to remember that. He calls me now sometimes, Scott. Not often, but when he does, we talk about practical things, and once he said she would have found out eventually. Better it happened while there's still time to deal with it. I didn't say anything to that. I thought it was probably true, and I also thought the calculation of better and worse in situations like these is something you never entirely figure out. I'm telling this story because last month I was at a garden centre in Barrie buying tulip bulbs for the backstrip, and the woman at the register recognized me from the news coverage, and she said, "You're the one who did that thing in BC, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I think that's me." And she said, "Was it worth it?" And I thought about the coin jar. I thought about the radiator. I thought about sitting in the 3rd row in my mint green dress while a man who built his fortune on inflated contracts told the room that some of us come from simpler beginnings. I thought about my daughter's face when she pulled the ruby-throated hummingbird notebook out of the box. I said, "I think so. I think it was." She put my tulip bulbs in a bag, and I drove home and I planted them in the backstrip before it got dark, and I thought, in the spring I'll be able to see them from the kitchen window, and that felt like enough. That felt like exactly enough.